Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Building a Fully Functional and Interactive Menu with Ext JS, hosted by Sencha. My name is David Green. I'm Marketing Manager at Sencha and will be moderating today's webinar. I am pleased to introduce today's presenter, Mark Guzmano. Before I hand the mic over to Mark to kick off the webinar, I'd like to take a moment to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on demand on the BrightTalk platform. Additionally, we will host a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If at any time during the webinar you have a question, please submit it via the questions panel. Mark, you now have the floor.
All right, thank you very much, David, and welcome everyone to our discussion of building menus with Ext JS. There's actually quite a few different types of menus you can build, and I'll categorize the specific type of menu we're talking about as we go through in this presentation. I put a little bit of a background in for you guys. I am a former Sencha architect and product evangelist. I've been doing Ext JS for a long time, probably about 10 years, and I'm excited to share some of the things that I've done and found, and in particular, some of the work that is in the product around the menuing system, which is a nice change from some of the other components that are out there. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about how you build application menus, which are those menus that are typically on the left side of an application. They tend to switch you between different views of your application. You can minimize them on the left-hand side, typically to a micro version. So that's the menu environment we're talking about. And I'm going to start from scratch because there are some tools and starter capabilities within the Open Tools Ext product that, if you haven't used, would be very helpful in this particular situation. And you'll see that once we get into some of the starter applications. So I'll start out with that. We'll generate starter applications. The reason I put that as a plural is that menus, in particular this menu that we're using, are available equally in the modern toolkit and the classic toolkit. So I'll obviously have to pick one to demonstrate to you, but if you're using either one of the toolkits, the things that I'm talking about and the applicability of this menuing environment and the ability to style it is all available 100% the same in both environments. So I think that's a good thing. We can cover the spectrum of applications. We'll then go in after we talk about generating the application and understand where a menu sits. In an Ext generated application, there is a certain structure to the application, and I want to explain that. I have a diagram that talks about that so that we can eventually get down to where the menu is in your application and into the particular Ext component that is used for a menu. That component happens to be what we'll call a tree list. It's an ext.list.tree component. So we'll look at where you can find information about that, how you create it, how you connect it with a store of data, what that store of data looks like, all of those things to get you up and running. And then we'll turn to probably the most exciting part of the menu is styling that component. And we'll use the concept of a UI, which is a capability that's in the theming environment of Ext JS. Fortunately, you're able to use these UIs apart from having to create a completely new theme. And the starter application that I'm going to show you has a UI to start with. So everything's going to be right in front of you. And along the lines, we'll do demonstrations and really give you a feel for how to do this. So as I said, the first thing we're going to do is generate a couple of starter apps. I've got a couple of starter apps generated so we don't have to watch it, but I do want to go into a little bit of what I mean by Ext and what the open tooling is. So some of you that have been around Sencha for a while know that there's a tool called Sencha Command, CMD, that is available to generate starter applications. And there's a template within that Sencha Command environment that generates a template application. Think of Ext as the next generation of that environment. It uses NPM and Webpack and all the modern tooling capabilities, and it is available through an NPM install. So if you haven't seen that before, this is where you want to go to understand how to do that. I'm in the documentation, the docs.sencha.com site, and I just click over to the Getting Started with NPM. So you'll notice here that one of the first things I would do is to NPM install at a global level the Ext tool. So -G is global, @Sencha is the organization name, and then Ext-Gen is the name of the tool. So we call it Ext. So I've already done that on my machine. So I've got an environment with Ext running. What I want to do is generate a starter application. And so let me go over to my terminal window, and let me first just type Ext. And you'll see that if I type Ext, I get details or a little bit of help on how you use the Ext generator. Probably the most important thing on this help is the examples. I use these all the time. So if I want to generate a modern application just for the desktop, I would probably use this step right here. If I want to generate a classic application just for the desktop, you'll notice that the template parameter has classic desktop. There are also several other templates that are available. Universal Modern, and there's a universal capability with classic. If you're interested in more details on how to use any and all of these parameters, it's just a very simple Ext help command. So you'll see here that if I run this, it'll describe all the templates that are available. It'll describe all the parameters that you can use. A pretty typical command line application. So what I want to do in this particular case is I want to generate an application for classic and for modern. Let me bring up the help again. And by the way, there's a shorthand to Ext, which is just Ext. If you just type Ext, you get the same thing. And what I really want to do is generate a modern app and generate a classic app. And in the slides, I put in the two environments that I created here. So I'm just going to run one. I'll pick a classic app just for the moment here. If we get some time, I'll run the modern one as well. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that example, come back to our terminal window. I'll clear it out so that we can see the maximum of this. And I'm just going to generate that app. So Ext, create an app, do it automatically. Don't run through the menus, the step-by-steps, although you could do that. Classic desktop and the name classic app. So what this is doing right now is it's generating the application using the classic desktop template. There is an equivalent modern desktop template that will give us a modern version of a desktop application. And as I said, this takes a little while to run because I am going out to NPM. I'm grabbing all the modules I need, including Ext JS itself, which is out on NPM. It's then going to do an NPM install. So all of that takes a little while. The end result, though, will be an application that is ready to run, that has a menu in it, and that menu serves several views, and that's going to form the basis of our conversation. So let's fast forward a little bit to the end result of that NPM install. So what I've done here is I've opened up Visual Studio Code, and let me make it a little bit bigger here, just to give you a better look at the fonts here. I've opened up Visual Studio Code to the end result of that generation of classic app. So you'll see here that there's a folder structure, probably somewhat familiar to a lot of you that have used Sencha command. There's a little bit of a different approach here, but for the most part, it is a typical Ext JS application. And those of you who are used to Ext JS will see some very familiar things. You'll see an app.json, which constructs the hierarchy of the application. you'll see here that this thing is using a build for the desktop that has the classic toolkit and has the material design theme. Both the classic toolkit and the modern toolkit now have a material design theme. I highly recommend you use that material design theme. It's built on modern capabilities. It's built to allow you to take advantage of CSS variables. The mix-in that we're going to use to style the menu uses those variables. So one of the big to-dos, I would think, for you is to see if you're not already using the material design theme, either in modern or in classic, to investigate its use. So we've got a classic material application. The structure of this application is defined by this class path. So it says that under app, anything shared would be in the shared folder. Anything that's the desktop would be in the desktop folder. Now, what is shared in this case? Nothing, because we're just building a desktop app. You may have heard discussions previous to this session where we talk a lot about building universal applications, where you have a desktop and a phone and an iPad version of the same application all in one project. So this particular folder structure follows that capability. So you have a desktop only folder, but beyond that, it's the same structure that you might be using. You'll notice there's a source folder. The source folder has folders for global models, global stores, and global views. And then down in here, we have the view menus, which we will be looking at today. So we have our generated application. If we run this application, you'll see that it produces a UI with a menu. So this is the classic toolkit look. There's the menu right there. There's the modern toolkit, and there's the menu. So let's go ahead and run it for this one. Since I'm using open tools, I just type npm start. And what will happen here is that the environment will do a build using Sencha command under the covers, just an FYI. And the end resultant application will be displayed in a browser. So since we're using the classic toolkit version, you can see that this one's got a little heading here with a picture. If we look at the modern toolkit version, it just has the word modern app. But in general, these applications are structured the same way. So we'll let this thing run. It's processing currently. Those of you, again, familiar with Sencha command know that it's running an app build. When it finishes, we're going to have an application structure that includes a menu, that includes a component that extends from ext.list.tree. And that's what we're going to take a look at. We're just waiting for this thing to finish loading. And as soon as it does, this is actually what we're going to see. We're going to see an application. I think right now we're probably right in the middle of it. And here's the menu. We only have two menu items, home and personnel. It has a main area, it has a footer, it has a header. And so before we go into the menu, I want to give you kind of an anatomy of this application. So when you do this on your own, you'll know where to find it. So let's go back over to the slide. And let's take a look at what this is finally coming up and running. So it took a little while to build. So once this finishes loading, it's going to show us that UI that we were just looking at. So what does this application look like from a hierarchy point of view? This drawing is really a representation of what it looks like. We've got a main view that encompasses the entire page, and that's in the classic toolkit in the form of a border layout. In the modern toolkit, there's a little bit of subtlety of what the layouts are, but the layout effect is the same. In a border layout, you can have different regions. So this nav view is the east region, or I'm sorry, this nav view is the east region, this center view is the center region, and this details view is the west region. The header view is the north region, and the footer view is the south region. So you can kind of look at these two and get that idea. So if I were to show you one of these pages, here's the, let me kind of put this over here. Here's the main view, which encompasses the entire page. The nav view is this section on the left-hand side, the blue shades. In the nav view, we have a top view, which is Welcome John Smith. We have a bottom view, which are these icons on the bottom here. And then everything in the middle here is the menu view that is an instance of an ext.list.tree. That's what we're going to focus on. And that's what we want to find in the application so that we know where to edit our environment. So let's go ahead back to the source code and find that. So the application that's generated is very nicely organized, and it should be pretty straightforward to find what we need to. So we know that main view is the first thing that we want to look for. So under app, desktop, source, main, there's main view. Main view, as I said, is a border layout, and the items inside of it are in different regions. So here's the nav view in the west region. Then we have header view, footer view, center view, and detail view, all the other things that are part of this application. We're focusing on nav. So nav view itself is a view underneath main. So here we are at the main folder. Here's nav and the nav view. The nav view itself has children. It has a top view, a menu view, and a bottom view. Top view, menu view, and bottom view. And menu view, which is what we're ultimately getting to, is here and represents an instantiation of an Ext JS tree list. So the tree list is what is used to create a menu. You'll notice that this tree list has some configs that we'll talk about, but it also uses the capability of Ext JS binding to connect itself to the data store. So let's understand that. So if we go back over to the code here, there's a couple of things, or the slides, there's a couple of things that we want to understand. We want to understand how a tree list works, and then we want to understand how that works in the implementation of this generated application. So probably the best thing to do to understand how a tree list works is to go over to the documentation. And as I mentioned before, the documentation or the examples for a tree list are going to be identical, whether you're in the modern toolkit or the classic toolkit. So I'll pick, in this particular case, I'll pick the docs for the modern. Doesn't really matter. They're both the same. So I can figure out what the configs and the properties and the methods are, but probably the easiest way to understand how a tree list works is to take a look at an example. And right off the bat here, we have a fiddle example that I can bring up in full screen mode. And this is a very simple example that'll give you the basis of what you need to build a menu. So you'll notice here that this menu has some interesting characteristics. Each menu item has an icon. Some of the menus have expandable children with icons. You notice that item 2 was expanded by default. I can expand item 1 and item 3. And all of those things at the moment are unstyled. They're just black and white. So how does this menu get created? Well, let's take a look at the code here and understand where this is created. So here is a create of a tree list. So the X type of ext.list.tree is a tree list. And the most important thing with this tree list is that it's connected to a store. So those are the only really two things you have to do to get a tree list to work. You have to define an instance, and you have to connect it to a store. That store will define ultimately a data structure, which in this particular case is this file data.json. So you'll notice that this structure is a hierarchical structure. It's actually called a tree store. So when you create this application and you create your connection to the data through a store, you're actually creating a tree store, and that tree store understands the hierarchy. Notice there's a children array that has items in it. That item may have a children array, and that forms this hierarchy that we're talking about. The key elements of that array are the text that's displayed, whether it's a leaf node or not, the font awesome icon class. So you'll notice here that there are different names. This first one is a FA folder. The one underneath here is an FA book. So font awesome by default comes into an Ext JS application. So that's really what you need to know to understand how a tree list works. So let's go back to the application and see how that's implemented so that you can do this yourself in this generated template application. So we're down in the view. We have a tree list. We don't see anything to do with the store here. So the first question might be, well, how's that work? Well, if we back up one level, the menu view is encapsulated in the nav view. So one of the sub-items of the menu view, of the nav view, is the menu view. And then on the main menu page of the main view, you'll notice a bind, an XJS bind to a store named menu. So ultimately, the connection of that data view is through this store named menu. Now, since this is a bindable data view, it's going to be available in the view model. So the NVVM concept is being put in place here so that I can get at a store through data binding. So ultimately, this is the store. And notice that it is of type tree. Type tree tells it to be a tree store. And in this particular case, it has a proxy to a URL. This URL is underneath resources desktop called menu.json, and it is a pretty much the same structure as what we just saw in the example, the fiddle. So we have a root node that's a false, leaf equals false, and then we have two children, one with the text home, one with the text personnel. Here's its icon class, and both of those are root leaves. So that is what ultimately displays this menu with these two icons here. The home icon and the second icon happens to be a table, an FA table. You are completely, it's completely your choice as to what icons are created here. So the first level of styling a menu is within the data itself. So which icon are you going to bring to bear? If we back up now and we go back to the menu has a key theming capability that all XJS components have. It's called a UI. And notice here that the UI that is set by default is called nav. I'm going to comment that out. When I comment that out, you'll notice the rebuild starts, and as soon as that's all finished, the application will reload. And we'll talk about what that UI is all about. So we've gone through, we understand where the menu is, we understand that a menu is just a tree list. A tree list requires a tree store, and that tree store is a hierarchical set of data. You saw me get the data from a JSON file that was hard-coded in the application. That JSON structure can be retrieved from a server. So if you have some sort of a dynamic menu that you want to create per user, or somehow you want to hide certain menus, and you do that by retrieving the data from a server, you absolutely can do that. And that's why it's built against the store. So we've talked about the structure. We've talked about using the tree list component. Now let's talk about styling, which is kind of the essence of what we want to get to. So I've already mentioned that we can use either toolkit, and both toolkits have the concept of a UI config. As a matter of fact, that UI config is something that's in the theme rather than in the component itself. UI configs are essentially pointers to theme mix-ins. So a mix-in is a set of theming things to allow that particular component to get its style. So let me go back now to the application without a UI set. So you'll notice without the UI set that this is an unstyled menu. In other words, it's just gray because that's probably the default color and a white background. Still a menu, still works, but it's essentially unthemed, or better yet, it has the default theme of a menu itself. And the reason, again, is that for this particular application, we were styling this menu through a UI. So let's explore what a UI is a bit more and how you build it, how you change it for your particular application. UIs are a big part of the theming environment. And as a matter of fact, they're used in conjunction with the CSS variables that are part of the material design. So if you're interested in what those variables are, in the documentation, there is a section underneath API called global_CSS. Global_CSS represents all of the global variables that are part of your application. That may be a new concept to you, so let me go back to the application and show you what I mean. So if I hit, if I go into the Chrome tools for this application, and I right-click on the application and I say inspect, you'll notice that the code comes up, but so does the CSS styles for the page. Look at this section here. This root section here, or :root, are all of the CSS variables that are set for this application that are used to create various looks and feels. Notice the base color. The base color here, if I turn it off, is affecting various things in the application. Obviously, I can change the base color. If I change it to, oops, I changed the problem. If I change it to red, you'll notice that just by changing that variable at runtime, I have changed part of the look and feel or the theme of the application. So CSS variables are very important to theming an Ext JS application using the material toolkit. If your question is, could I do this programmatically? Could I do this in my code? Absolutely, you could do that. So this is just a capability within the CSS environment to use global variables, global CSS variables, and this list right here defines all those variables. So the one variable I was just dealing with is $base-color. Those variables ultimately are in the theme and can be changed or generated from CSS or SAS files. So let's go back to the application and see where we have the opportunity to put theming variables in this application. You'll notice that each one of these views, main view, nav view, menu view, also have a parallel SCSS file. Now that's not an XJS file, that's a SAS file. That is a, SAS is a language that makes CSS a little bit easier to use. That's basically a CSS file. That is a file that if put in this folder of the same name as the view, the XJS development build process will pick up and include in your project. So a very nice capability. Notice in the menu view that there are several variables that are being set. If I wanted to set base color here, for whatever reason, I could just type in $base-color and give it a color. And you'll notice that SAS, unlike CSS, even has function. So I can have a function to lighten the color. So my opportunity to make modifications to the theme can happen in the theme itself if you're making a lot of changes. But in this particular case for the menu, I can make menu-specific changes right within the CSS file. But I mentioned that we're doing those changes in a mixin. So what's a mixin? Well, this is a mixin. Tree list UI is a mixin. How do I know tree list UI is the mixin that I use for a tree view or a tree list? Well, it's documented. And if I wanted to actually go and look at that documentation, I would find it in the ext.list.tree item. Oops, put down the wrong one. There we go. And here's the tree list UI. So this mixin generates styles for ext.list.tree widgets, which is exactly what we want. So what this particular documentation is telling you is all of the variables that the mixin uses to generate the mixin UI. Think of a mixin like a function call. So if we go back to the code, we go back to our mixin, you'll notice that the mixin include tree list UI. One of its first parameters is the name of the UI. So this UI is this parameter right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new UI so we can see how this works. So I'm going to create another UI. I'm just going to copy portions of this one. So we'll create a UI here and close it off. And this one I'm going to call MJG. All right. And I have quite a few different variables I can change. These are all documented. I just showed you the documentation page. I can pick one that might be of interest, maybe some color. How about the background color? So here's a variable, and I'm going to copy this just to save myself typing. And I'm going to put this in here, and I'm going to actually change this color. I'm not a very good designer. To a hard-coded green. Obviously, I can put as many or as few variables as I want here. Notice as I'm making these changes, by the way, my Visual Studio Code environment is set to do auto saves. So every time I'm making a change here, imagine me hitting the save button. And every time I do a save, the command that I started, the npm start, is watching my code, rebuilding, and regenerating the UI. So if I go back to the UI, I will see this application getting rebuilt. At the moment, it's going to rebuild the same way it did before because I don't have any UI specified. But what if I created this UI and I changed it to MJG? So now it's going to use a UI. It's going to use the MJG UI. It's going to find the MJG UI during the build process in this menu view.scss folder, and it's going to create that menu UI with just one variable, which is the color. And you'll notice that absolute colors can just be typed in. Your application is probably going to be a little bit more sophisticated. You can use RGB values. You can use hexadecimal values. You can use these functions to lighten existing colors or darken existing colors by a certain percent. That's all totally up to you. But I think I picked a variable it's not going to show. So background color is the actual background color that we're not going to be able to see just by making that change. So let me find something else that might be of interest. See. How about row selected? We'll do that one as well. Again, we can take as many of these as we want. And we can just continue to add them, continue to put in really ugly colors. So I can make this one red just to highlight this. And again, every time I make a change here, this is going to be rebuilt. Let me just make sure there's, yeah, I need a semicolon. That's probably what the problem is. So I just needed to finish off. So this is the complete syntax for a UI. It includes a semicolon. So presumably when this finishes building, the look of the menu is going to reflect that particular UI, which in this case, I've only made one or two very significant changes, background color and row selected background color. But as we peruse through this list, you'll see that you have a lot of flexibility on what you've changed with the menu. Row indicator width, item icon width, the item icon font size, because it is just a font, awesome font, the line height, the text over colors. So you basically can change the entire look and feel of the menu. So here's our really ugly looking menu with a background of green. And if I had sub items, I guess that the one I selected would deal with sub items, but you get the idea even with just the green here, that just by making this one change and using this UI within the menu, I can affect the change without changing the application at all. I am just changing, in this particular case, the theme by creating a brand new UI. So let's go back and talk about a few other things with the menu itself. There are other ways to change the look and feel of the UI that are more programmatic. One I want to show you is best shown using the, let me find the example in the kitchen sink. So if you're interested in examples here, if you go back to the kitchen sink, which is available in examples.sencha.com, and I'll pick the kitchen sink for the classic toolkit. Again, all these things are applicable to the classic or the modern toolkit. We have an area for trees and tree lists. So here's an example of a menu, just like we saw. It has a hierarchy, but it has a few little options that you can use. One is the fact that you can either have a single expand or a multiple expand. So if I change this and I try to open up an item, other items will close. That's somewhat of a styling thing, but that's an option that you can control programmatically. The other thing that you can control is whether you want to apply a UI to it. So you'll notice here that just like I did in the application, by clicking on this button, I'm applying a UI to it. And you know, this button doesn't have any special styling. You'll notice that if I click on this, it has styling of all the colors. My hover color is different. You got this little indicator in the front. I can specify if this expand and contract is on the right-hand side or on the left-hand side. So a lot of functionality. I'm also able to use what's called micro mode of the menu. So micro mode represents a collapsed menu. So a lot of people will put a hamburger menu or a 3-line menu somewhere where you click on it and it will basically do what this is doing, making it micro mode or non-micro mode. Micro mode also has this interesting characteristic is if you hover over the items, they will display. So this is a fully functional menu, even though it's in micro mode, and it really saves a lot of real estate from the standpoint of maybe looking at some big drawing or some big form that you're using. Everything that's in this particular example is controlled with code. So you'll notice that micro mode as a button is controlled by toggle micro mode. So I've got a button here. Sorry, this is so small, but the handler is on toggle micro. So by tradition in an Ext JS application, that will go into the controller. Here's on toggle micro. Here's the one line of code that deals with that. So the tree list has a micro property that can be set to true or false. and it is a config variable. It's a config variable, meaning that if you're going to set it, you use the setter. If you're going to get it, you use the getter. So micro is the property. It's a config. So that means there's a set micro, and set micro is either set to true or false. So very, very simple to make a dramatic difference in the look of your application on the menu. So we've looked at the generation process for XGen. We've seen that there's a lot of value, even if you're not using XGen and you're not using the open tooling. I would strongly advise you to generate this so that you can basically grab what's in this template. This template has been built to give you best practices for an Ext JS application. So Sencha command doesn't have this template. So even to just generate the code and copy and paste out of it, this would be a valuable thing to do. You'll notice that every single one of these are done with best practices. If I went up to the login menu or I went to the home view, not only does it have a SAS file, but it has a view controller, and a view model. And those are latest best practices as XJS since version 5 can do MDC and MVVM. And you saw how the menu takes advantage of that by creating the store within the view model and then just data binding. So there's a lot of good reasons to use the templates that are part of the open tooling environment. The other thing I'll just mention about the open tooling template environment is you can create your own. It's a lot easier to do that than in Sencha command. In Sencha command, you could create your own templates, but no one really knew that. In open tooling, you can create your own templates, maybe tweak the templates for your project team, and then when they generate their starter applications, it's going to be to your specifications, to your standards. And, for example, if you have a look and feel for your menu and you want a custom UI in every template that's generated, you wouldn't even have to have anybody change the UI. You could provide the UI that you want for your application, and that would be a part of every generated application for your team or for your organization. So there's a lot of benefits to taking a look at the templates that are part of the open tooling environment. Okay, so talked about mixins. We've talked about the specific mixin called TreeList UI. You may have a question, do other components have mixin? Absolutely they do. So although not as complex as the tree list or the tree view, a button can have a mixin. A grid can have a mixin. Those mixins can be one-off. In other words, you can use the UI on just one of your grids for your application to make a particular grid look a certain way or a particular button look a certain way. And that's all done with this concept of writing a mixin function. And if your mixins are applicable to your theme in general, instead of having them in the source code for your application, you can use a tool like Sencha Themer to build in the mixin capabilities into your generic theme, and then everybody will get that just by specifying your custom theme. So theming itself is a very rich environment. It's something that we probably should talk about in a future webinar, but this really comes in a really easy to use format with those SAS files being right next to the views. All right, so you've got everything that you need right now to create your own themable menu, that left side menu. It's really easy to generate these starter applications. As you saw, everything I needed was available. Just for those of you who are using the modern toolkit, let me just quickly show you the modern toolkit version of this, because you'll notice that it's quite similar. So I'm going to bring up a modern app that I generated, the one I generated with the XGen tools. You'll notice this modern app has the same file structure. desktop, source, view, main. We remember that the nav view is where the menu is. Here's the menu. Here's the menu view. Again, also using the ext.list.tree, also using a UI. It happens to bind the store at this level. Probably a little bit easier to understand that it binds it at this level because this store is associated with this menu. If I go into the SCSS file or the SAS file, it uses the same tree list UI mixin, and there's a little bit of variation here. The padding is hard-coded here. If we go down here, there aren't as many things in here, but you have the entirety of all the variables that are available. And here's an example. The background color is just darkened by the base color by 20%. So pretty much the same structure, and it's the same component in the modern toolkit. So however you do this, even if you have an existing XJS application, use the ext.list.tree component as your menu. The JSON structure will be the same however you use it. As I said, you can retrieve that structure in a hard-coded fashion from a JSON file, from a server with an AJAX call. That can be a custom menu per person. And then finally, however you want to create a mixin, either inline or within your theme, take advantage of the mixin system, not just for menus, but for all of your components. And to do all of that, take advantage of the material theme that is now available both in the modern toolkit and in the classic toolkit. It's been available in the classic toolkit for, I don't exactly remember which version it started with, but it has been available for several versions. It might have been built for version 6, and we're on the cusp of version 7.3. So you certainly have that available. All right, so with that, I will turn it back over to David to see what questions we have, and I'll answer whatever questions or whatever thoughts you guys have on this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate it. Fantastic presentation as always. As Mark mentioned, we're going to go ahead and switch things over to questions from the audience. So I would like to remind you that if you do have any questions for us, now's the time to go ahead and ask them in the questions panel. So to get things started, the first question asks, could you make a presentation on how to build an application using XJS? Not the default app generator, but really build forms, buttons, login page, and etc. Thanks.
Sure, that's an excellent suggestion. I think one of the things that I'm feeling, certainly with this topic and in others, is that revisiting some of the basics to get started is a very helpful thing for the community out there. So absolutely we can do that. Please send suggestions of things like that to the marketing team. We are very happy to do those, and my opinion is this is the most crucial information you could have. You want to get things started correctly. And so best practices on building what a lot of people build with XJS, form-based applications, grid, etc. Yes, wonderful topic idea. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And piggybacking off of that, I would like to go ahead and say that in terms of getting in touch with our marketing team, you can contact us at communications@sencha.com, or probably the most effective way is just on these webinars. You can go ahead and submit those topics like that, as you just did, and we'll be able to see them since we do cover all of these questions. So we'll make a note of that presentation topic, and we'll look forward to including that in one of our future presentations. So thank you very much for doing that, and we look forward to doing so. Great. The next question asks, can I use more than one UI?
So yes, the UI itself is a variable. So if I go back to the documentation, so if I wanted to look at the documentation for a tree, there are two main things up here. One of the things that actually is a part of most all components is a config called UI. So here's UI, right? you'll notice that UI is a data bindable property or config, and it has a get UI and a set UI. So what does that mean? That means you could dynamically, just like I was setting any other variable on a component, I can dynamically change the UI by calling set UI. And I can give it a different, you know, if I have MJG and I have nav, the two that I currently have in the application, I can change those programmatically. Take that a step further. Maybe you're having users, you're giving users the ability to customize your application, which includes customizing the way the menu looks. So as a user logs in, you determine who that user is. Once you know who that user is, you find the UI for the menu that they have stored, and then you call set UI, and it will change the menu. So a very, very powerful way to provide for, you know, customization and uniqueness for your users, and it is a very simple thing to do. So if that's the context of your question, can you use multiple UIs? The answer is yes. Can you use different UIs across different components? The answer to that is absolutely yes. You can have a button that has a UI called, you know, bold. You can have a menu that has a UI called simple, and you can have as many of them as you want. So it just reduces down to the SAS code that you have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
So we have another question that came in. Asked, the tree view is a great source of grief and wasted time for me. I've been trying to create a dynamic recent menu item with 10 dynamic sub-items added as the user clicks through the application windows. During modifications of the tree store, the structures behave erratically and sometimes get a looping reference. Expanding one item show the menu itself, for example. If I load the structure at startup time, all is well. Is tree store possible to reload dynamically, and with what command? Load data?
Yes, I don't know off the top of my head what the commands are, but the answer is absolutely. You get events as you click on menu items. So you can have a dynamically built menu structure. You're faking it out by, you know, making it look like there's sub-menus when the data is not actually there. I would say in your particular use case, I'd have to see the details of what you're doing, and I'd be happy to do that. If you want to grab my email, I'll, you know, we can collaborate a little bit on that. But yes, that's one very interesting capability is not only can the menu itself be dynamic from the beginning, but it can change over time. I mean, this is great for use if you're trying to secure certain parts of the application. You know, by not even showing the menu, users won't even know that that capability is there if they don't have authorization to it. And as I said, you can dynamically load the beginning of the menu, but in your use case, yes, you can dynamically load submenus on a menu click. So I just have to take a look to see what may be causing your woes. But send me an email on that.
Great, thank you, Mark. Next
Sure.
question asks, in case of dynamic tree menus, what should be the type of store? Is it static or maybe built from remote DB?
Excellent question. A store, by definition, is the data that's associated with a tree. There's a proxy associated with a store. So your store can have a static proxy. It can actually have a memory proxy, which means the data is hard-coded. It can have a JSON file proxy, which means it's not static, but the JSON file is static, so it might as well be. But that proxy can also be a REST or an AJAX proxy, which means the data is retrieved from a server. So that's your use case for a dynamic treatment. And not only is it retrievable from the server, but you could write logic. And like I said, you could have maybe a standard base menu, and based on the user logged in and maybe looking at security credentials, you could populate the end resultant database call back to the store to have whatever menu items you want. So yes, this is the menu is perfectly situated for those situations where you want it to be dynamic and you want it to be based on, you know, security credentials. So, and that's done through the proxy.
Wonderful, thank you, Mark. Our next question asks, can you provide proper tutorial videos apart from webinars so anyone can learn from the ground up? I'll go ahead and just say very quickly that we did just relaunch a new and improved resource center. that contains a lot of very helpful tutorial videos, such as the one that you were specifically requesting here. So I would go check out our most recent blog, as it has a link to that new resource center, which should give you access to videos such as the one you're requesting.
Yep.
So the next question that we have is, I have just started with Ext JS. Can you please conduct a section for basics of Ext JS from scratch?
Well, again, another great webinar topic example. I think just starting from scratch, you know, I kind of took this particular webinar and I probably made a lot of assumptions. I made a lot of assumptions that, you know, you knew what the structure of an Ext JS application was, you knew what Sencha command is. You know, this wasn't the webinar to describe all of that, but absolutely we could back up and we could do the same generation and spend the time to understand what the structure is, why things are in a certain place, what happens under the covers. So, David, let's take that one back again as a very good good topic. It's kind of revisiting the Ext JS from scratch. Awesome idea.
Of course. Yeah, and as for future webinar suggestions like this one, if we don't necessarily reference them in our questions as we're reading these off, don't worry, we still received your request, but we want to make sure that we're running through the more technical questions. We will be sure to log those ideas and suggestions within our webinar ideas folder. So thank you very much for those suggestions, but if we don't reference them in the future, that is why. The next question asks, hi, is there a way to use classic toolkit components in modern toolkit like trigger fields? Thanks.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not mix and match. You can't take a modern toolkit component and use it in classic or vice versa. There is a way to write components that can be architected to be used in both environments, and the tree list is one of those. If you really got under the covers, you'd see that there's classic parts to it and modern parts to it. I'm not sure which one did you say, the trigger view. I'm not sure if that one is built that way. I would certainly take a look and I can provide more commentary to you, but a raw classic component cannot be used in a modern application. That's without there being some kind of conditional logic.
Thank you, Mark. Looks like we have time for one or two more questions, but we'll have to wrap things up. This next question asks, can you build a proper full-scale responsive website where you have front end as Ext JS and with different back-end servers and databases?
Absolutely. That's probably the sweet spot of Ext JS. As I mentioned, the way you communicate with a server to get at data is through a proxy. So a store, in this particular case, a proxy connected to a store. But if you just had a need in your Ext JS application to get at data, you would make an AJAX call, which is basically the proxy part of a store. And any server that you're going to use today can be the server side of that, can produce RESTful endpoints or AJAX endpoints. And the nice thing about how Ext JS is architected is it's 100% in the browser. And those connections to the server are very well known and pretty much standard. So you're hitting on the sweet spot. Yes, any database or server backend that has that ability to do AJAX or REST can be a front end to Ext JS. It's the way it was architected.
Wonderful, thank you. Looks like we are just about out of time. I'll go ahead and take this one last question asking about migration from XJS 6.x to XJS 7.2 or the current latest version. If you go back and look through our webinar library, we actually have a specific series that's dedicated towards migration from 6.x, 5.x, and 4.x onto the latest version. So if you go back and you reference those, you'll see that we have a free tool called Upgrade Advisor that makes this process a lot easier and more simple than trying to do it on your own. So please go back and refer to those. We'll also be sure to address this and some of the other questions that we received in a follow-up blog post. With that, I would like to go ahead and pass things off to Mark for any final remarks. Do you have anything that you want to say?
No, I appreciate the input on things that you guys need. I mean, these webinars are here educate you, and the best source of what we should be doing is input from you guys. So really appreciate that feedback.
Fantastic. Well, really appreciate everyone taking the time out of their day to join us for this presentation. We always really enjoy bringing these presentations to everyone, and we, of course, always enjoy having you, Mark, on with us. So we're looking forward to working with you again in the near future. And to everybody else, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us next time. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.